But yes, at the beginning, I thought of any way to catch a fish that I could, and that included using 4 or 5 different baits, from worms to salamanders to frogs, and also going beyond that. I never blew up. I never put a bomb in a trout stream, but I did.
Well, hi, everyone. Tim Schultz here. Hey, I hope you're doing well, and I want to thank you for listening to the Reading the Water podcast. I really do appreciate it. Well, this episode features the incomparable writer, editor, and publisher Nick Lyons, a national treasure who needs no introduction to anyone familiar with fly fishing literature over the past half-century. As the founder of Lyons Press, Nick published enough great books to fill every shelf in your den, and his own book, Spring Creek, I'd say that's undoubtedly among the best fishing books ever written. Thomas McGuane said Nick Lyons is a remarkably unpretentious writer, given all he knows and how well he writes. I don't know how anyone could disagree with that. But that's enough for me. Let's get Nick on the show. Well, Nick, welcome. What an honor it is to have you here today.
I am delighted to speak to you, Tim. I'm a fan of yours, and I'm honored to be talking to you here under these circumstances.
Well, no, the honor is all mine, and it's such a great pleasure to have you here. Let's see, where are we talking with you today? Are you in the city?
Yes, I am. I have an apartment in the city. I still spend most of my year up in Woodstock, New York, but I'm here in an apartment that I have.
Well, it turns out on my end, my son and his wife are going to be moving to New York City, and I believe they're going to be about 4 miles south of you, around Greenwich Village, maybe a little west of that. As a parent from the Upper Peninsula, should I be worried about the kids?
Well, it's a big city, and odd, awful things can happen in it, and an awful lot of good things. I think Greenwich Village is more fun and more interesting probably than any other part of the city. I almost moved there several times, and it was just that I had too many connections up here with my wife's studio. I would have lived there as my first choice. So I'm envious of them going down there. I hope they love it.
Oh, I think they will. They're adventurous. So listen, we're going to cover quite a few topics. I want to talk about fishing with you, writing, publishing, but let's get started. I want to talk about. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you how many fly rods you own, but among all of the fly rods you own or have had, any of them stand out as your favorites?
I had several really remarkable bamboo rods, and there was one by Dickerson that I liked very much. It had been Art Flick's rod, and he signed it to me.
Wow!
And I had a wonderful Garrison that had been a Sparse Gray Hackles rod that I also loved.
Wow!
But for many, many years, I have used the Winston rods in graphite. Someone who likes the feel of what he uses. They have satisfied me very much. So I know a lot of people who still like bamboo. And John Girac, by the way, wrote a book that I published on fishing just with bamboo. A wonderful book.
Right.
And he is a lover of bamboo, as many of my friends are.
Yeah. Well, Nick, you fished in a lot of different places, different rivers, streams, ponds, lakes, oceans. When you look back on that, any of those places stand out as your favorites?
Oh, I think it would have to be a Spring Creek, and certainly a British river. The Kennet that I fished was lovely, a wonderful chalk stream. But the best, I think, was the very special chance I had to fish Odell at Spring Creek near Ennis, Montana, which was in private hands and gave me immense pleasure over many years.
Well, your book has given us immense pleasure. When was the last time you went back?
It was 2015. I went there with Bob DeMott and Craig Matthews, and I trudged around and then found that the river, for various reasons, had been silted over and the fishing was poor. The water temperature was very high. There were very few bugs on the water, and we spent several hours at it, and I didn't see a fish. Bob DeMott has written about that visit. It was a sad one in ways to see that, but I have the old Odell in my head, and that's quite a lively memory to go into my old age with.
Oh, absolutely. Hey, speaking of Bob DeMott and Craig Matthews, you fished with so many accomplished anglers. And when you think about them, is there well, I guess I'll break this up like the Academy of Motion Pictures handles movies, and you can pick categories, right? The most skilled you fished with, maybe the funniest angler, or perhaps any other types of characters. Do any stand out?
I think Craig Matthews is probably the best. In the waters that he knew, my friend Pierre Affra, a Frenchman living in Paris, who fishes about 300 days of the year or more, he is an extraordinarily gifted fly fisherman, fishing all types of waters. And I fished with him several times and have been awed by the things he does with a fly line. I think that fishing with Herb Wellington, who owned Odell Spring Creek and has since passed away, was one of the most remarkable fishermen, very careful. He cast probably 1/100th of the amount of times that any other fisherman would cast on the water, only to rising fish and only a particular moment in the cast. And he cast beautifully, so that one of my great pleasures was watching him fish. I think that Mike McGill was always fun to fish with. I don't think anyone was really a comic. I probably would have enjoyed Ed Zern, but I never got to fish with him, just to have lunches with him. But I've had some very good companions. Mike McGill, who edited a number of very good books on fly fishing, was older, very gracious, and a real gentleman. And we fished, particularly the Catskills, many times, and he would always give me the best pool and vanish into the trees so as not to bother me while he was fishing.
You know, you touched on this a bit when you mentioned Ed Zern, but, you know, you fished with so many terrific anglers. Are there people you wish you could have fished with, but you just didn't ever have the chance to fish with them?
Sure. I mean, some of the wonderful fishermen that I've read books by, I think Roderick Haig Brown would have been a wonderful person to fish with. I would have liked to fish very much with Tom McGuane, whom I think I'll be able to speak about a little later, whom I think is the most interesting of all fly fishing writers in our time. And he is someone whose novels I appreciate, whose letters give me a great joy, and I think I've never been on the water with him, and I'd like to. And then some of the British writers like Romilly Fedden, who wrote Golden Days.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Nick, I'd like to talk some about your writing.
Yeah.
So you have hundreds of wonderful essays, and I was just looking over the book Fishing Stories, which is a collection of those. And one of the first ones, I believe the first one in the book, is called First Trout, First Lie. And and the last story in the book is called Indian Summer of a Fly Fisher.
Yep.
Well, when I thought about that, I thought about this concept of, I guess people call it stages.
Yeah.
And when you get into fly fishing, you want to catch a fish, you want to catch it any way you can. And then eventually you want to catch a lot of fish. And then you want to catch a big fish, and then you want to catch challenging fish, difficult fish. And then you get to the point where you just want to watch someone else catch a fish.
Mhm.
And I noticed that the first story is about catching a fish any way you could.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the last is about helping and watching a dear friend catch a fish.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you feel that you went through all the stages? And did you spend more time on one of them? What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think they're roughly the pattern that most, particularly fly fishermen or general fishermen, go through. It is at the very beginning, which I began at the very beginning at about 5 or 6 years old. I don't remember exactly when. But yes, at the beginning, I thought of any way to catch a fish that I could. And that included using 4 or 5 different baits, from worms to salamanders to frogs, and also going beyond that. I never blew up. I never put a bomb in a trout stream, but I did. But I did once tie, and it's in the story. I tied I tried for a trout that I found in a little Catskill Creek in the middle of the summer. I tried for him every way I could with all the baits, all the ones I could think of. And finally, I became so determined to catch him that I tied a very large Carlisle hook on the end of an alder branch, and I got down very, very carefully. I did catch almost anything that moved in those days, and I slipped it. The trout was just below a rock near the bridge, and I slipped the hook right down into its mouth, which was opening and closing, hooked him and pulled the poor thing out, and kept it and ate it that night. And after showing it to everyone I could find, but yes, at the beginning you want to catch it any way you can. But that fades, and I think that changes into the second stage of wanting to catch a lot of fish, which has happened to me. We would go out on opening day of the trout season in New York State and start fishing at 12 o'clock at night when the season opened. And we would not go back without a full limit of trout. Most of them fish that had been stocked. But yes, I used to like a lot. And even when I got out of the Army many years later, but had not yet started to fly fish, I fished a lake in the West where the trout were all piled up in a little spring in an alcove. And I can remember taking a lot of trout on a spinning rod, a spinning lure. So many of them that some of the people there asked me if I'd get one for them, and I didn't, but I came very close to being the biggest fish hog you ever heard of that night. And never since. I've never done anything approaching that since. Catching a lot was certainly what I wanted to do. I never was a big fish fisherman. I have as much fun with a 6-inch brook trout and wild brook trout in a little mountain creek as I have several times fished for tarpon. And it's exciting the first time you see something over 100 pounds jump. And then a little tedious for me, since I don't know a lot of the tricks, to bring it in. And I really have never particularly done more than revel at the excitement of catching a trout bigger than I imagined was in the creek at times, but I've never fished directly for that, and I've never been after that, and it's never been anything that gave me satisfaction. I think that in the later years, the interest in catching a particular fish has become more prevalent in my fishing life, and I tried very hard to fish to specific fish the way the English do, when they require it on their chalk streams, and that gave me the greatest pleasure. It was not necessarily for big ones or even particularly difficult ones that I was trying to find, but just to fish for them, and to, I think that the prize was not random or arbitrary. It was something that had been earned. Now I love to watch someone catch a fish. Sure, I've had to stop fishing about 2 or 3 years ago, but it still gives me enormous pleasure to see someone catch a fly, catch a fish on a fly, and sometimes be of some help in having that happen. So I've gone through that cycle.
Well, I'm glad to hear you passed up the bomb stage.
Yes.
Somehow I'd never pictured you using a bomb on fish, but I guess I felt a little relief to learn you hadn't.
Yes, it made a wonderful story, but it was, and I've never been embarrassed at saying the honest and controversial thing about myself. It happened. I want to report it.
Right. Hey, let's keep talking about your writing. You've talked about this before, and you've written about it. Mecca and First Trout, First Lie. I believe those were the first fishing stories you wrote when you broke away from academic literature.
Yes, they are.
And that's where you found this wonderful voice. And what I'd like to have you talk about is, well, were there influences on that voice, or did it come organically? Was this a decision that you'd write stories about fishing? Did you come to that as an epiphany, or was this a deliberate thing?
Well, I'd always loved fishing, and I always wanted to write. That was a stable to it, and I was hopelessly unable to write. I never wrote anything that got published or looked at or praised until well into my 20s. And people tell me that something I've written sounds like I was a born writer. I'm not. No one is. Very few people are born writers, and I was the least of them. I think what happened, if you let me go on for just a few minutes on it.
Certainly.
I fell in love with literature, changed my mind, had gone to the Wharton School, but really got very little out of it and never was interested in it. And after the Army, I went back to school as a freshman because I had suddenly fallen in love with literature. And I read everything I could get my hands on, from Martin Eden by Jack London, which I remember, and some silly murder mysteries, finally to people like said esoteric writers like Sir Thomas Browne. And I somehow had all of these streaming around in my head and started to write again. And it all didn't sound like me at all. It sounded like the composite of a lot of them, particularly Hemingway, who is such a great writer at his best, and is someone who so many writers, particularly on the outdoors, have found ways to imitate, and which is a terrible thing. Bad Hemingway is very bad indeed. I think finally, after I'd been teaching for about 7 or 8 years and had read enough to get a PhD and so forth, I was in my early 30s when we spent a summer in the country, and I tried to write. I wrote some what I would call straight stories, stories having nothing to do with fishing, and they all seemed to me very, very stagey and having very little life in them. I think what changed me is the thing that's changed at least a dozen writers that I know, and no doubt hundreds others, was Hemingway's story, Big Two-Hearted River, about fishing a river called the Fox on the Upper Peninsula. Brook trout at that time, just brook trout, and with live bait, with live grasshoppers. But I think that I saw that, and I think John Girac has said something like this. I saw that writing about fishing, which I had loved from childhood, was something that could become literature, because that is a very great story that
Mm-hmm.
has weathered almost 100 years, more than 100 years now, and was recently reprinted by itself, actually. But it was when sometime that summer, I had written some critical essays that had gone into those little literary quarterlies, like the Yale Review and the Minnesota Review. And then I went on a long trip with a man named Frank Maley, which was hilarious, fascinating. And I just sat down and wrote something called NECA. Sent it off to Field and Stream, got rejected accepted a few days later, and then wrote another, which I liked even better once I was thinking about prose style, called First Trout, First Lie, which I think is much closer to what I thought of as my voice that I found then. So it's something I found very late, something that I think I try to, everyone who's asked me for any advice, I tell them you've got to find your own voice. There's no formula. There's no model that you can put into your head and have it work. That's when I started, and that's when I made a connection. And I think, to speak of the influences, it's everyone I read. Hemingway was the most direct at that time, but it was all the various people from Jane Austen, who never mentions a trout in her writing, to some of the very great writers today. It just was, as many people say, I think John Girac says this also, it was the thing I knew best. Mm-hmm. I knew fishing so well that when I began to write about it, it felt very comfortable. And at that time, I began to think of something that was not academic, like the essays I was writing. I published a critical book on an esoteric poet, by the way. But I had not written any story that I thought was my voice, that I had loved to write, and that I felt had a future for me as a way of writing. That's a big mouthful, Tim.
That's great. So I'm gonna thinking of this genre, the idea of fishing stories that are stories, not techniques or methods. If we were going to build a Mount Rushmore for this genre, who would we put on it? Now I know you won't put yourself up there, so I get to put you up there.
No, I won't.
And I'm going to put you right next to John Volker. But I want you to fill the rest of the mountain for me.
Sounds like good company. Well, the mountain I'd have would probably have about 10 or 12.
Go ahead, we can do them.
But I think that Ted Leeson is a perfectly wonderful writer. He's written only 3 books, but a lot of other stuff as well, essays and the like. I think Bob DeMott is late to the game, but has become very quickly one of the very best essayists and writers about fishing. He brings a tremendous wealth of literary excellence to it. I certainly want McGuane up there. He is one of my, possibly my great favorite, because he is such a rich human being himself, and his interests, his manner of expression, the total devotion he's made to writing. He's written screenplays, regular novels, of course, but also a great number of short stories and a decent number of essays on sport, on fishing. I certainly have him. And I know Norman MacLean reasonably well. I had reviewed his book first, I think, from galleys for Fly Fisherman magazine, and I don't think anyone had reviewed it at all then, or at least he said no one had. And he looked me up because it had been a good review. He was in town for a convention, as I remember, and we spent a long afternoon together. I loved the man that I was there. He was so earthy and wise, and we got on very well. So just so many that I know that I respect immensely. Walt Weatherell, who is not quite as well known as he should be, has written book on Vermont fishing. And Jim Babb. I'd have a lot. I'd need a mountain to put them all on.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you mentioned him, but I know just from talking with you in the past, you would put John Gierach there.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and
I think that John,
Yeah, I want to talk about him just a minute and get your perspective on this.
Of course.
It seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that he could be a singular example of someone who's made a career of writing fishing stories without another paying writing career or having his own secret life as a professor, as a judge, as an insurance salesman, or something else.
Yep.
Is he alone in that?
Yeah.
John, that is?
I think there have been a number of people who have done it. John is particularly adept and has a style that is readily available to a large number of people. John's is just as broad as there are fishermen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the remarkable thing is that he never talks down to anyone, the way John Volker never talked down. He had his voice, which happened to be a voice that we all like to hear. John is a very careful, thoughtful, extremely knowledgeable, and extremely well-traveled and well-fished, so to speak, a writer. And I think it's remarkable that he has written so much about all sorts of fly fishing, not just trout, and not has a sense of repetition. There are some repeats of the same kind of thing happens, but not very often and not very significantly. When you read him, you get the experience of fishing, you get the morals of it, you got the techniques of it mixed in on what happened, but not too many techniques that make the less initiate worry about it. I like his work very, very much, and I think it is full time for him. He makes a living. He does several columns.
You know, I saw an interview or listened to an interview with Tom McGuane, and he was talking about John Gierach, and he said that when he came out with the book title Trout Bum, McGuane said he thought two things. It was a wonderful title and a wonderful idea.
Yes. That makes good sense.
Yeah.
I've seen some of John's. I'm sorry.
Oh, go right ahead.
I've seen some of John's early poetry, and I liked it a lot. I don't think it has the stature that the writing about fishing has, particularly fly fishing, and I think it's that the reach of fly fishing is so broad. If you have the intelligence and the access to do it as much as John does. The only person who fishes more is this Frenchman that I mentioned before, Pierre Affra, who fishes all the time. And that would be too much for me. I do other things in the world too.
And speaking of the other things, when you were a professor, did you teach fishing literature ever?
No, I didn't. I think I had one course where it became possible to speak about Big Two-Hearted River. But beyond that, no, I'm afraid I used fishing images enough in classrooms. but because the fishing was always in my mind, but I never taught it. I taught the 17th century English prose, 19th century novels in Russia and England and the United States and a lot of others, but not fishing.
So,
I think that the best training is for a writer is reading. The readers become your mentors, and the books become your mentors, and the span of interests and the skills are the skills that you learn best from reading. Non-fishing, I don't think you need to read a great deal of fishing to become so-called fishing writer, but I do think you have to read a lot of very good stuff to be as good as someone like Ted Leeson or Bob DeMott or Tom McGuane.
You know, and we've been talking a lot about these fishing stories or lyrical books. Of course, in your career as a publisher, you published an awful lot of books on technique and knowledge, like Art Flick, Tom Rosenbauer's books. And several of those were incredibly successful, sold. I think I heard an interview with you and Tom, and he said that the Orvis fly fishing book, it sold over 500,000, I think.
I think it's up around that.
Yeah. In general, writing about bugs, knots, leaders, casts, it could be a pretty dry topic. Is there a secret to those books? What is it, being first, or is there something about the presentation that takes something that is kind of inherently dry topic into a widely appreciated book?
Yes, it's a hard question, a very, very good one. And since most of the people who write about fishing do write about technique of some sort, I think it begins with knowledge. It's a very hard subject to fake at. And I knew people who wrote prominent places like Field and Stream who hadn't been fishing in 10 years or something of that sort. I think what you get with Art Flick is somebody who in the season fished almost every day, had spent part of his life as a guide, and who had studied the insects firsthand by catching them and studying everything about them, and working with one of his visitors, Preston Jennings, to add certain other skills. So I don't think Art was at all a fussy writer. He wrote down what he knew in a clear and effective way. And that's what made that book so popular. And he had a good idea for it. Just the hatches as they occur on Catskill rivers. I think that is the beginning of it, the kind of knowledge one has. And I think that Tom, who is much, much broader in his experience, I published his first book, the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide, which I think has gone through several incarnations. And I remember Tom telling me when I gave him the edited version, but there's so little editing on it, Nick. I said, I'm not afraid to edit, Tom, and I've been very, very heavy editing on some people, but the writing is clear and it's effective, and it tells us what we want to know about these various things. He doesn't have to juice it up in some fancy way. He makes it understandable and lively and honest and very, very helpful. I'd put Ray Bergman in that category as a good person to learn from, who had good experience, never seems to bluff at all that I could ever find, and tells you a tremendous amount about the trout we pursue and also the ways of doing that. I think the bugs are interesting, and some people become too fascinated with them, I think, and it does get hard. You get a lot of Latin coming into it, and you've got probably more than you need to know as a fishermen about it. And as a result, the people who want to know that kind of knowledge, and it's a perfectly good kind of what these insects are like in their full bloom. But as far as fishing concerned, someone like Flick or Tom, they write about how it's useful to you, a certain kind of knowledge. And they don't go much further than that because they really don't have to. Some of the things that went on, very worthwhile in our more modern period, are books like Selected Trout, in which you have new not inventions, but new concepts of fly tying, of presentation, and where and how the fish are going to behave. And those two guys worked very hard in doing it. I don't like to speak about which ones I have to edit hard, but then there were a few. But the heart of the Swisher Richards book is that they came up with ways of fishing that were not very well known beforehand, and that have really led to many innovations beyond what they said. For instance, the hackleless fly has become, in many ways, in many different incarnations, an enormously effective trout fly. Craig Matthews has something called sparkle gun, and what you have is a special kind of tail that sparkles a little bit, which picks up the light, and you also have a very trimmed out body. Those are enormously effective flies, and sooner or later a fly has got to produce for you, or someone was just giving you something off the top of his head.
Right.
It's a good question. I can't write that way, and I on the other hand, I like to read knowledgeable people like that. But I don't like them to get fancy, and I don't like them to get muddled. I don't like them to get too chummy with me either. I think your writing is wonderful, by the way.
Well, thank you.
It doesn't fit into those categories and moves from, that category, but it's very much close to the literary writing. I think you're awfully good at it, Tim.
Why, thank you. So back on let's talk about the storybooks, the more lyrical type of things. You in your book Spring Creek, one of my favorite paragraphs, and I've got many favorite paragraphs in that book, but I'm going to read it to you. It says, I'd like the stew to be rich enough to catch some of the stillness, complexity, joy, fierce intensity, frustration, practicality, hilarity, fascination, satisfaction that I find in fly fishing. I'd like it to be fun because fly fishing is fun, not ever so serious and self-conscious that I take it to be either a religion or a way of life or a source of salvation. I like it passionately, but I try to remember what Cezanne once said after a happy day of fishing. He'd had lots of fun, but it doesn't lead far. And that you were writing about your own writing, and I think that ought to apply to everyone's writing. When I think about fishing stories that I like, I think you captured it. But I want to focus on the word fishing. It seems like there's a lot of things that people get passionate about in their life. People love to golf. People love to go hiking. They love to go biking. All kinds of things. But maybe I'm just unaware. But why is it that fishing is such a great canvas for finding these stories, and it doesn't seem to happen to the same extent in these other areas of endeavor that people get engaged in?
I think that's one of the great questions, Tim. I think that there is some very, very fine writing on hiking and biking, and particularly on golf. There's a great anthology by a man named Herbert Warren Wind, who wrote for the New Yorker on golf. And there are some wonderful golf stories in that. Fewer probably on hiking, though certainly you could include climbing mountains, and John Krakauer writes brilliantly about that. I think that part of the distinction is whether they're about that in a purely technical way, or whether they have something in them that rises above the information they're imparting. And I think for my money, I don't like pretension. I don't like laying it on with a trowel. I like it to be more invisible, that it has got to come close to capturing an event. And the event of fly fishing is just infinitely more varied and has more chances of bringing out all of those other qualities of life that I mentioned than golf. To stick with golf for a moment, you've got a limited number of objects to get the ball in the hole. You've got a limited number of options, also in the sense of golf courses, a place where this is done, doesn't have the variety. And in fly fishing, you have this immense number of different factors. You've got the natural world, you've got the bug world, you've got the movements of the trout, you've got the activities of the fishermen, and what they feel and who they are. I think that it's partially that it seems to me quite inexhaustible, and the number of really good fishing writers over a long period of time, as I've tried to put in a couple of anthologies I've done of other people's work, and an early one called Fisherman's Bounty. I was surprised at how much good stuff there was. Chekhov, de Maupassant, writing about it. There's also the best Russian memoirist of the 19th century is a man named Aksakov. Very few people have heard of, but he was mad for fishing, and found it in his most profound books of commentary on the Russian writers of the time, Tolstoy and others. He manages to put in sections that are wonderful writing about fishing. In his case, toward bait and the like, and then toward what we like most in fly fishing. But consider the number of flies, the different sizes of flies, the technology of the fly, the tectonics of it, the architecture of the fly. You hold these together and you've got an infinite number of subjects to write about.
You know, Nick, one thing that I think of, and I would like to get your reaction to this. What I think good writers, and we'll stick on the fishing topic, what they're doing, I kind of think of it as, at its core, it's a fishing trip. They leave the house, they go fishing, they come back. Yep. But I kind of think about it as like an old time gold miner. You fill you fill the plate up with just a gob of debris and there may be a few flecks of gold in there, so you swish it and swirl it until all the junk's gone. I mean, that's kind of what's happening, right?
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
And when and like
an awful lot happens. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, and like as you say, John Garak, that's part of his. I think he is excellent at finding that little speck of gold, and that's the story. And I think you were excellent at doing that.
Well, I had 1/10 the regular fishing experience that John has, among other things. He's he really knows so much and is such a thoughtful and interested human being. He's interested in everything, and those qualities are important.
Yeah.
There is a lot of ego in fly fishing that I think is very, very obnoxious when it happens.
Absolutely.
There's people who, I once gave a talk someplace, and the guy said, you're not, I can see you're not very good. I could show you how to get 30 trout in a day. Well, no, I've never caught 30 trout in a day. I would stop long before that. But there are people who just want to prove how good they are. And there were some big names that wanted to do that in the field who would exaggerate the number of fish they caught or the size. Craig Matthews tells a funny story about someone who fished, he was guiding and fished a part of the day and got one nice rainbow about 15 or 16 inches. And Craig says in a quiet voice, and remarkably, by the time we got back to West Yellowstone, the fish had grown 6 inches. And I think there's a lot of exaggeration. Yeah. I had some authors that would write to me that they had 60 fish days or something. And I wondered whether they included inspection rises or not. Right. And I wondered how they could possibly be willing to be interested in catching so many. I would think it would be boring.
Right,
perhaps. Right. You know, I think that's what happens. There are different types of people, and I think that finding that gold is something some people don't look for. They give you all the rocks and detritus from the river, but not the gold.
You know, one of my, I guess my opinion about skills you need for fishing. Obviously, you need to be able to cast, fly fish. You need to be able to read water, and all types of physical skills and mental skills. But one you don't hear mentioned a lot is you need to listen really well.
Yep.
And
absolutely.
And I see so many people that claim to be great anglers, and I suspect they are to some degree, but I wonder when they learn, because they never want to hear someone else's story, it seems.
Right. Yes. I think that is so. Henry James has a statement that a really good writer, with a very good writer, nothing is lost. They don't. It is all. They see more. They hear more. They understand more, and they listen to what other people say. They don't let their ego get in the front of it. I'm talking a lot today, which is unusual for me.
It's great.
I think that much more listening is helpful if you want to write well. You asked me the question earlier about, implied the answer. Where does one learn these things, or how does one learn how to write better? And I would have to say you have to be drawn to a great deal of reading things that you may at first dislike, but that will show you all sorts of things about writing, which is infinitely interesting. Jane Austen, even though she has people in a specific society mostly concerned with who's going to get married, perhaps, or how honest or honorable someone is, that is far removed from most of fishing. I think she, Virginia Woolf, and dozens and dozens of other writers really should be read. You have to be a widely read person. Hemingway always speaks about taking a book bag with him when he goes fishing or goes out into the field. And it doesn't have to be obsessive, but the best teaching will come from the right reading, and listening. I think you're absolutely right about that. Everybody brings different knowledge to the whole sport. Wellington was a brilliant caster and had an acute understanding of when to fish and how to fish, and I could listen to him all day. He didn't talk much, but when he talked, he always said something of great interest to me.
On that topic of Herb Wellington, so you and Herb were in communication. He invited you to come out and fish Odell. You went out and I suppose everyone's going to have favorites. Wrote what is my favorite of your books, Spring Creek. When you went to fish, did you know you were going to write that book when you got on the plane to head to, or drove to Montana, however you got there? And if you didn't know it
I
from the
did.
start, when did you figure that out? When did you know you had a story?
That's, I'm very happy to talk to that. Herb and I had lunch a number of times, and we'd had Bob DeMott now has our correspondence. I kept Herb's, he kept mine, and Bob is now looking it over. It's very extensive correspondence. We wrote back and forth. And then I guess after I'd known him for a year, he invited me and also my wife, Mary, to come out to Odell. Didn't have the slightest idea what it was, except that a friend of mine had said it was a wonderful stream with very big trout in it. So we went out for a couple of weeks to stay with him at his ranch on Odell, right near the Madison River. And I didn't have this. The first week or so that I was fishing with him, I had no idea of writing anything. I didn't understand what was happening, why I wasn't catching fish. I think it really took me about, I guess we went out for a month the first time. I guess it took me until the third week, perhaps, or fourth week, before I began to see what was happening. And then I decided to write perhaps one essay on it. I think I owed one to the little column in Fly Fisherman. And I wrote a column, and that I thought was the whole thing. And then during the year, I thought, well, there was a lot else that happened out there that I've never written. I don't take notes, so it would all have to be in my head. And the second time I went out, I said, maybe there's a book in here, particularly about what this river has taught me, and how it has been a participant. It's a me and Odell story, not a me and Joe's story so much. And it was the second time I went out that I began to think seriously of writing it. And then after that, I went a third time and finally finished the book. But it was not an easy book to put together. I didn't know what the narrative would be, I'd never really put together a book on fishing. I'd collected things, which is very different. This was a book on one coherent subject. And that was good to contemplate, but it did take a couple of years really to fill in the pieces and try to make it coherent, moving from bewilderment really at the beginning to some real knowledge. I mean, when in the second year, when Herb said to John Goddard, who is a terrific fisherman, Nick will show you how to fish it. I could have floated, but it was a place where I could catch fish as well as it was a very fixed situation. And once you learn it, there were things you could do. Lefty fished it. Lefty Cray once with me, and he tried to fish over a couple of fish. He's a brilliant fisherman, spectacular counselor. And he didn't catch a fish. He said, why don't you try, Nick? And I got one on the second cast because I knew certain things about the creek, not because I had any great skill. I think that sort of thing happens. And that's, I hope, part of what got into Spring Creek, that the river really is talking to me about what it wants to have written about it. This has been nice talking. I can talk more. I'm a garrulous old man, but sadly can't fish anymore for a number of reasons at 91. But I enjoy talking about it very much.
Yeah, I know that Bob DeMott and Craig Matthews keep you informed with pictures of fish and stories. Occasionally I get included on one of those, and I love seeing them just as much as you do, I think.
Yes. It is nice. We have our ears open when they write to us, don't we?
We do.
Some of it is so interesting, and so it keeps me so connected to the water now that I don't write about it anymore.
Yeah.
Though I wrote one story about catching a fish when I had gone back to college. I caught a salmon in the Hudson Valley. But that's another story.
Yeah. You know, Nick, I went fishing last night on a small local stream here. And while I was there thinking about talking with you today, it occurred to me that books like Tom Rosenbauer's books, I remember one of the first books I bought was Prospecting for Trout. And of course, I had the Orvis Fishing Guide. And I was thinking, if I took all of my books, I'd put them in two categories. One, the ones that taught me how to fish, as I learned from a lot of those books. And but then there's this other collection of books, your books, John Volker's books, John Gierach's books, that taught me how to love fishing. And I think those were more important to me. What kept me going back to the river was looking for my own stories. And I think that's the magic of those books, that when I see a wonderful story of yours, and also, you know, singeing your fly off your line and not noticing it, you know, that I thought that would make me think, you know what, I fell in the river the other day, but well, Nick Lyons falls in the river. It must not be so bad, right? And
that's wonderful, Tim.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to chat with us, share some of these stories, wonderful stories. You've got so much knowledge about writing about fishing and fishing.
Well, thank you, Tim. Now, I have enjoyed your talks that I've seen on video very, very much. You're talking with people about fishing, and I'm happy to have been with you today to do this.
Well, thank you very much. And if my son and his wife move to New York, if you're in the city when we're visiting, I'll be sure to look you up if you'll have me.
I would indeed have you anytime if we're in town, and let me know beforehand.
Certainly will.
I can't give you any good fishing. I have fished in the Hudson, but mostly the people I saw were eel fishermen, so I can't provide anything of interest. But we can talk, and talking is always good.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here.